us know, Wipro has been a beacon of progressive HR practices in India for a long time. And it's great to be able to chat with you about diversity and inclusion. This is fairly new in India, at least in the private sector. We know that from a perspective of government, we've had a lot of progressive D&I practices, but specifically for the private sector, this is something that companies have started speaking about today. I wanted to sort of start off by asking you, what's the imperative for D&I? What drives that? Is it merely a moral imperative, or is it rooted in business? How do you think of D&I?
Thank you, Sashi, and thank you, People Matters, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be talking to a bunch of HR specialists sitting in this room. So it's indeed a real pleasure to be here. On the topic of inclusion, I must say, you talked about moral imperative, Sashi. To me, if moral imperative means doing the right thing, then so be it. It is a moral imperative. And at least I can talk about it from a Wipro context. We've always been guided by our values, which is do what is right. Mm-hmm. And by doing what is right, to me, inclusion falls in the same bucket as I would handle honesty, as I would handle integrity, as I would handle respect. So it's part of the DNA. It's part of something which has been guiding us for so many years. And I know there is a fad in terms of saying business imperative, so on and so forth. But like I say, as long as it is doing the right thing, if it stems from that and you get a business benefit out of it, then it's good. But, and of course, there are enough and more studies which say that, companies who focused on this, there's an indirect correlation to your business results. But I'm just thinking logically, Sashi, here, obviously you have different minds, you have different ways of looking at the problem, the way it is solved, the way people discuss, debate, collaborate, different ideas. So as long as that is the spirit that is encouraged when we talk inclusion and diversity, because I also know that a lot of companies will probably focus on the diversity part.
But not the inclusion.
For the sake of saying that I'm a diverse company, you might kind of check all the boxes on the number aspect. But I think that is, you will fall flat. It's not sustainable.
True.
In the long run, what is more important is, are you inclusive? Even if you had one person from that marginalized section, did they feel included in the conversation? Did their voice matter? And if that truly is the way the organization culture is, it is bound to, I'm just saying it's bound to reflect in your business parameters as well.
Yep.
So the way I look at it, to your question, if it stems from moral perspective, why not? Because to me, the moral perspective is all about doing the right thing. And that's how, at least at Wipro, we've looked at it. But would love to hear your point, Sashi, on this.
Thanks. From our perspective, Sunita, we are a company that helps people get jobs. And helping people get jobs means helping all people get jobs. And unless our employees reflect the all, we are never going to find out what it takes for people to get jobs and how a platform like Indeed can help them get jobs. So for us, like you said, it is a moral imperative, but it's also a business need because we need to reflect the society that we live in.
Exactly. And at least for an IT company like Wipro, which is 100 plus nationalities, 100 plus countries that we operate in, it becomes important that we reflect what the local communities are about. It's important that we reflect. So it's, I remember there were times when clients would come in and you would have all these men in dark suits going in and attending that call. And it would look fairly funny because you're not really reflecting what the client looks like. And that would seem a little strange to them as well in terms of doing business with you. So I agree with you that it's equally that you should reflect what the stakeholders are representing. And so as a result of which the business line does come in there.
Yeah, and you mentioned reports, right? So recently, specific to India, we published a D&I report. And very surprisingly, almost 56% of the employers, the companies we spoke to, said that they are not completely aware of all issues surrounding D&I, and they aren't doing too much. So from your perspective, where do people get started? and specifically sort of deriving from the Wipro experience?
So I'm surprised that there are so many companies which are still saying that, because I can understand if it was a decade ago and people kind of found it strange to focus on diversity inclusion. At least from the Wipro learnings, I can say that it's important for the simple reason that you've called it out, right?
Yep.
You've called it out where people understand that these are the basic minimum ways in which one can work in this organization. Two, it's important that you have the leadership support, Sashi, because until and unless the leaders are lending in their shoulders to support it, it will always be that affinity bias. You know, when I'm recruiting, I always want someone like me. And until and unless there is someone to challenge me in terms of saying that you have to get a diverse perspective, it's until and unless I get that nudge, I don't know how automatically it will come into a person. So the biases that exist, how do you kind of call it out? How do you kind of make people aware of it? These, to me, are starting points for any organization which is trying to set out on it. Third, my single advice would be, don't go after it with a metric. I know that metrics drives behavior and everybody wants to, see their numbers going up. We consciously kept away from it. We never talked numbers any time during the journey, for the simple reason that even if remotely it could affect the way people thought and behaved, we didn't want that to influence our overall programs. So it was always about do what is right, and the numbers will follow. So if companies are wanting to start on this journey, my single most advice would be, don't get carried away with all these reports and these numbers and these check boxes. So I'll give you a simple example. We started with gender because we said it's something visible that you can see. Now I remember a time, when we started with gender, and my boss at that point in time called me and said, we want you to lead this framework around gender diversity. And my first response was, why would you want to do that? Because, this is a merit-based organization where I've never felt discriminated. So why do you want to call out gender? Because I don't want to feel different from the rest. But today, of course, I think differently, because all said and done, this is a marginalized section, right? And how do you give them a voice? Maybe you've had the voice, maybe you were lucky. As Wipro is growing, today we are 250,000 employees, 100 plus countries. It's difficult until and unless you call out and set out what are the basic ways of working. And the reason I say this is, I remember when we started, and the buzz at that time was, you should do something on disabilities. And we said, we're not ready. So let's start with gender. Let's get our feet, completely soaked in with respect to what needs to get done. And then we will go into the disability, because it's an important area. But we don't want to do something for the heck of doing it. Similarly, when we embarked on LGBT, a lot of companies were then talking about LGBT, and you have this ERG. And believe me, there were team members who came back and told me, but Sunita, why aren't you setting out on this? Because it's important. XYZ company's done something. And I said, so be it. But until and unless we're ready, our leadership is ready, they stick their neck out, they want diverse voices from this section of the community, I don't think we should embark on it. So be clear that, one, the leadership buy-in is there. Two, that you don't go after it just as a metric, that you truly drive the transformation from a inclusion lens and not just from the diversity lens. And I think just calling it out, making people aware, tackling the biases that, and believe me, there's nothing wrong in having that bias. Because a lot of times people say that, I am bias-free, so-and-so has this problem. And my answer is, all of us have biases. Just look within. The moment you hear examples being called out is when you realize that maybe it is the way that I was brought up. I think it's right. And hence I behave in a certain manner. So, there were times when a lady had just given birth, and there was this lucrative assignment overseas. And it was a very caring so-called manager who said, what's going to happen to your child if I send you on site? And he overlooks her, and send somebody else. And the only thing that we told the manager was, did you ask her?
Exactly.
So just give the decision making to her. Let her decide. Because, if she feels that I can't, then so be it. But yeah, so that was a good learning. And I think at least that's how we've gone about it in our journey, Sashi.
I sort of want to pick on two things that you said now. The first was your initial reaction when your boss called you in and said, you need to do this. We need a more gender diverse Wipro, and your reaction. I think it's important to also point out that all of us have multiple identities, and sometimes the privilege of some of our identities sort of covers for the disabilities we may face because of some other identities. And so it's important to sort of remove those blinkers and think through. And the second point I wanted to, sorry, if you wanted to.
No, absolutely. I'm saying bang on.
And the second thing I wanted to touch upon what you said was leadership buy-in. And I think that's so important. And it's also important for leaders to be connected to the ground because, again, as part of our survey and the report, we found a significant disparity between how employers that said that they're working on D&I felt versus how the employees felt. The employers were saying, look, we are doing a lot to tackle issues of diversity, making our companies more inclusive. But when we spoke to the employees of that companies, they said, you know what, this isn't working. We don't feel it. We feel discriminated, either basis on language, on gender, on multiple issues. So as a company, how do you think a company that approaches D&I should address this issue? How do you get to the pulse of what your employees are feeling, and how do you incorporate that into planning for D&I?
I think this is a brilliant eye-opener for organizations because, like I rightly said, if you've gone after it as a number game,
exactly.
Then this is what people will say, that this is not what I wanted, and exactly the same examples that, I feel excluded in this conversation where you've called me for the discussion, but what I've said either doesn't register in your minds, or whatever I've said gets mansplained by somebody else, and that's acceptable. So I think, you have to truly include these voices, and if the agenda is that I have a ERG which focuses on gender, on LGBT, on disability, but on the ground, you're really not listening to these groups on what they want. So I think, Sashi, the main point here is, are you willing to listen, right? Are you willing to listen with an intent to make things correct once you've heard these voices? So I'll give you different examples. Let's talk about disability. In the beginning, and again, the same approach that we had to disability, because we had folks who were disabled in the organization, but there was nothing specifically done to seek out what else. And the moment we had a focused group which was focused on disability, look at the number of changes that came in. Simple things like technology, The accessibility issue was not something that we ever cared about when we were developing software. And now it's become a mandate that whatever you do, please have that filter. Whichever building that you make, it has to be in accordance with the, with a disabled-friendly kind of an infrastructure that you create. So I think these become automatically ingrained in your processes the moment you are really hearing the employees and wanting to do something. Otherwise, it would be more about, okay, raise your hands, how many people, with a disability exist in the organization, and that really doesn't count.
True.
Let's take another example, and these are things which I feel if you have really heard what your employees are saying, it makes a lot of difference. So one thing that we heard from women, who had gone on a break.
Yep.
It's natural. I've gone on a maternity break. That's a choice I made. I did want to take care of my kids during that phase. But hey, after 5-6 years, I'm ready to come back, right?
Yep.
I have experience. I know what it is to deal in a corporate world. But companies are saying, you've got a break in your career. You're no longer good. Yep. We will not hire you. And hence, this is an entire lot which gets kind of moved away. And all we said is, if this is a voice that we've heard, then what can we do to get these people in first? And Sashi, it's not easy because, they've lost their confidence. A lot of women that we've spoken to, 7-8 years of gap, I'm scared to get back into the corporate because, technology has changed, people have changed, so many millennials in, do I really fit in? And what we've done is a program called Begin Again,
where we say that, well, you might have had a break, but we understand that all you need is a little bit of a nudge, a little bit of a push, right? Both on technology and on just how do you come across in an interview, your confidence building, right? So that's what Wipro is now focused on, to say that, if you're interested, raise your hand, come into Wipro, we will train you. We will train you for what is that gap. Because clearly, I don't want to be hiring you just because you're a woman, just because I have a